So I really enjoy it. I founded ITS in 2002, and we've been one of the largest title insurance agencies in the state since then. And just looking forward to giving you folks some information today to hopefully help you avoid any pitfalls or issues that could come up in a contract, and make it to where when you write a contract, it's solid and you don't have any problems. So, okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, got an area there for notes and questions. Okay, this is the new purchase contract, which I was actually involved in helping with this through the ULTA when this new contract came out. So there's a lot of good things that came from this. The first thing I want to point out to you is in paragraph number 1, where it refers to the earnest money. It says that the earnest money shall be deposited with the brokerage, the buyer's brokerage. So that's an important thing to note. We'll get into that a little bit further here in a few minutes, but important to note that the contract actually requires the earnest money to go to the buyer's brokerage. Okay, and then in paragraph 1, something that changed there that you folks have probably dealt with and is more and more common is 1.1, the included items. We now include the solar panels in any real estate transaction. So if you go out on a listing appointment, those solar panels, if you see that there's solar panels on the home, very important to start addressing that right away because the solar lenders are not the most cooperative. They don't understand that they've created a lien oftentimes by recording a UCC on the property and different things like that. So if you see that there's solar panels, really important to start talking with your seller immediately and find out whether or not those solar panels are paid off or whether they have a loan on those. And then at that point, get with your title company so that they can start working on that, and get with also the buyer's agent if you're representing the seller, and make sure that they understand that those solar panels are there, and whether or not the buyer maybe even wants to assume the underlying obligation, or let me rephrase that, not underlying, wants to assume the obligation of the solar loan. So really important to know that, because if that's the case, then we have to go to the buyer's lender. They have to do additional qualifications and everything to make sure that the buyer's going to qualify with their debt to income and everything to take over those loans. And then they can assume that loan at closing, or what we normally require is that the seller is going to have to pay those off. So really important to address that, because that could be a very big swing for your seller if they have to pay those off as far as what they're expecting to net from the sale. Because a lot of sellers don't understand that those solar panels are now affixed and included in the contract. So really important to note that. Okay, and then that will be our first keyword today, is solar panels. So I'll give everybody a minute to answer that, or to deal with that. Write that down. Do you have to do 2 fingers when you slide it? Okay. Ooh. Okay. Oh, right there. Okay. Then the next item we want to address here is the water service. This changed as well. Oh, wait, let me go back under 1.2 in the other included items right there. Very important to note, and in this world of doing split closings and everything, we often see what the other title company, the documents that they're preparing and everything. And oftentimes they're not doing this, but under 1.2, it says the above checked items shall be conveyed to buyer under separate bill of sale. So really important to make sure that if there's washers, dryers, refrigerators, microwaves included, that the title company prepare a bill of sale for those personal property items. And that is, again, required under the terms of the contract, and a lot of people don't know that. So really important to make sure that that's there. Okay, section 1.4, that also changed. The property shall include all water rights or water shares, if any. So, and then it says that the water shall be conveyed or transferred to the buyer at closing by applicable deed or legal instruments. Then it says the following water rights shares are specifically excluded from this sale. So that's really important to note. We can get into water rights in a little more detail if anybody wants to call and chat with me about those, but water rights are basically assigned to a particular piece of property, and they run with that piece of property. Oftentimes it's secondary water for irrigation or livestock. Water shares are very, very different. Water shares are actual ownership in the water through a separate water company where you have a stock certificate, a water stock certificate that gives you ownership in and to that water. So very, very important. If your seller has, say, 20 shares of water, and maybe they have 20 acres and they're selling 2 acres, and they have 20 shares of water, I guarantee they're not going to want all 20 shares to go to the new buyer for the 2 acres. So very important to talk with them about that. If they've got water shares that they are planning on keeping, that those are specifically excluded under paragraph 1.4. Otherwise, they are automatically presumed to transfer to the buyer. So you got to be really careful with that. Okay, and then under section 3 we come down to where the purchase price and everything is there, and everybody understands that and how to fill that part out. So I won't get into a whole lot of detail on that. The settlement and closing is an important part under section 3. And if we go on to section 3.2, there we go. I just want to go through with you what the actual closing means, because we always talk about going to closing, and sometimes that gets confusing for some people because we've now got basically 2 processes. We've got a settlement where the buyer and sellers come in and execute the documents and deliver and deposit any monies required to complete the transaction. And then the closing is defined that as, under 3.2, settlement has been completed. The proceeds of any new loan have been delivered by the lender to the seller or to the escrow closing office, and the applicable closing documents have been recorded in the office of the county recorder, recording. The actions described in 3.2 and B and C shall be completed no later than 4 calendar days after settlement. And all those deadlines are at 5 p.m. So basically what that does, you guys, is that gives the lender, after when the buyer comes in and closes, we send the documents back to the lender. They do a final funding review and everything. And that gives the lender basically 4 days to complete the funding of the transaction to accomplish recording. So the transaction's not actually closed until the documents are recorded in the county recorder's office. And that, again, goes back to the lender delivering all the sums and monies that they need to provide. Okay, then we're going to go on to section 4.2, which is special assessments. And this is something that we worked very closely with the Division of Real Estate with as a title industry, because these were getting to be a real problem in that the management companies for the HOAs were trying to dictate who would actually pay for special assessments, transfer fees, things like that. And they would actually say that it's the buyer's responsibility to pay, which was very problematic because the buyer had no contractual interest with those HOA companies at all. It was the seller. And so we just had a lot of times where those would blow up at the time of closing. So I commend the Division of Real Estate for clarifying this. Excuse me. Because now it says that any assessments for capital improvements under 4.2 as approved by the Homeowners Association or as assessed by a municipality or special improvement district prior to the settlement deadline shall be paid by, and then that becomes negotiable. So if you're representing the buyer, obviously you want to check that the seller will pay those. So that's a really good thing, is because it's negotiated right up front and it doesn't cause us delays or problems when we get ready to close. And then on section 4.3b, rental deposits and prepaid rents. If you go out on a listing appointment and you find out that your seller is actually leasing the property or renting the property, very important at that time to get a copy of any rental agreements that they have and get it to your title company, get it to your escrow agent as soon as possible so that they can make sure that everything is prorated and everything at the time of closing, and that we can also let the buyer know what rights that tenant has and when that lease expires. So really important to make sure that's done, because we have to actually do a debit credit for any security deposits that are paid, and then we have to do a proration for any rents that have been paid. So, and then it's really important that we do an assignment of the contract from the seller to the buyer. I see a lot of times that doesn't happen, but it's really important to do so because we want to make sure that the buyer then takes over the seller's position in that lease and that the tenant then is notified that that is happening. So really important to note that on that part. And then the HOA entity fees, they're due upon change of ownership. I'm just going to read that real quick because this is where we've really had some problems. Some HOAs, special improvement districts, and or other specially planned areas under the governing documents charge a fee that is due to such entity as a result of the transfer of title to the property from seller to buyer. Such fees are sometimes referred to as transfer fees, community enhancement fees, HOA reinvestment fees, etc. Collectively referred to in this section as change of ownership fees. Regardless of how the change of ownership fee is titled in the applicable governing documents, if a change of ownership fee is due upon the transfer of title to the property from the seller to buyer, that change of ownership fee shall at settlement be paid by. So that's really important to note because some of these fees, especially in areas like daybreak and things like that, are getting very, very expensive. So really important to note there that that's negotiated at the time the offer is submitted. So if you're representing the buyer and submitting that offer, obviously you want to check that it's the seller that's going to pay those. And you can actually change it to say split 50-50 or whatever that may be. So, but I would recommend, if you're representing your buyer, just check that the seller will pay it. And if the seller wants to renegotiate that, they'll have to come back through an addendum to do so. Okay, I'm now going to go down to paragraph number 6. Okay, this is important as well. It says title to the property. Seller agrees and represents that the title convey marketable title to the property to the buyer at closing by a general warranty deed. So that's really important to know because oftentimes we'll have sellers who say, no, I only want to give a special warranty deed, or I only want to give a quitclaim deed. And the contract actually requires a general warranty deed. So that warranty deed contains warranties that pass on to the buyer that guarantees the buyer marketable title to the property. A special warranty deed, sorry about that, somebody's really impatient. I'm going to turn this off. Hang on 1 second, you guys. That same number is called 3 times already. Okay. All right, so a special warranty deed only warrants title for the period of time in which the seller held title to the property, where a general warranty deed warrants title all the way back to the time of the patent. So they are very different documents, and a quitclaim deed only conveys title as to if the buyer has it, or if the seller or the grantor actually has any interest. So a quitclaim deed just says, hey, if I have any interest, I'm giving it to you. A special warranty deed says, hey, I'm only warranting title for the period of time in which I own the property. And a general warranty deed warrants title all the way back. And the contract requires a general warranty deed. So if you've got a seller who says, I only want to transfer by a special warranty deed or a quitclaim deed, that needs to be dealt with in an addendum and agreed to by the buyer if we're going to change how title is to be delivered. And then 6.1a is the long-term leases or rental agreements. Again, Those documents have to be provided to title and to the buyer so that everybody can review those documents and make sure they know when the leases expire, if there's tenants in there, how much the security deposits are, how much the rents are, so that everything can be calculated through the closing. Okay, and then I'm going to skip over to section 6.2 to the title insurance. Okay, this is really an interesting area because the contract requires the seller to issue an ALTA homeowner's policy of title insurance to the buyer. So in the state of Utah, in some states, the owner's policy is negotiable. In some states, it's required to be paid for by the buyer. But in Utah, our contract actually requires the seller to pay for it. So it's important to note that your sellers understand that they've got to pay for that. And also the homeowner's policy gives a lot of coverages that other policies do not. So we don't get to use, you folks don't usually get to use this contract when you're dealing, or the construction contract that we'll get into here in a minute, when you're dealing with a builder. But really important to note that most builders' contracts are only going to provide the buyer with a standard owner's policy. Okay, and that standard policy does not give any coverage with respect to mechanics, liens, and things of that nature. I'm going to tell you, my industry is not real good, and it's kind of a shame, but it says that the homeowner's policy is required to be provided by the seller. And if the homeowner's policy is not available, either through the issuing agent or another title agency, then the seller agrees to pay for the buyer a standard owner's policy. So in some cases, on some properties, if it's multiple parcels, if it's meets and bounds, things like that, then the homeowner's policy is not available. The underwriters, and just so you know, the homeowners and the Eagle, First American has an Eagle homeowners, which is the same as the homeowner's policy by all the other underwriters. But if the property is meets and bounds and it's not located within a subdivision, or if it's multiple parcels, oftentimes the underwriter will not issue the homeowner's policy without getting additional information like surveys, doing an inspection, things of that nature. So they tell the agent, you can't issue a homeowner's policy on this property. And so the title report goes out, the commitment for title insurance goes out, the PR, and just says standard owner's policy. But nobody ever relays that. I shouldn't say nobody. Most companies don't relay that to the buyer, which should happen because the buyer is anticipating getting a homeowner's policy unless it's not available. So if it's not available, then the title company should be relaying that information to the buyer. And oftentimes they don't. They just issue a standard, a commitment for a standard owner's policy and never say a word about it. So when you're looking at your title reports, when you get the title report from your title company, I highly recommend take a look at that. It's in the very first paragraph of Schedule A that says that they will be issuing either a standard owner's or a homeowner's policy. And that homeowner's policy gives a lot of different coverages, and we won't get into all that right now. So, okay. And then paragraph 7, the seller disclosures. 7C says a commitment for title insurance. So our commitment, our PR, is part of the seller disclosures. So I always recommend give yourself enough time there to make sure you don't have any contractual problems. I have seen over the years where buyers and sellers will get in a dispute, and that will come back to that title commitment because oftentimes people put the seller disclosure will be delivered within 24 hours. Then the title commitment doesn't come along until 72 hours. So immediately that gives the buyer an out. If they really wanted to pursue it and really wanted to get out of the contract, that's an argument that they could make, is that the seller did not provide all the seller disclosures. Also, we should be delivering, the title companies should be delivering any restrictive covenants with that commitment so that those can be transferred to the buyer or passed on to the buyer. And any long-term leases or rental contracts. And I is evidence of any water rights or water shares. So that's why I say it's really important that your listing agreements, guys, to ask some questions whether there's any tenants in the property, whether they have any water rights or water shares that are going to be transferred, because that all comes down as part of the seller disclosures. And we don't want to ever put ourselves in a position where a buyer has an out because we haven't met our seller disclosures. So I always recommend give yourself like 3 days on those seller disclosures just to make sure you get the title report and everything so you have a good solid contract. Because I will tell you too, in some areas of town, in some parts of town, like the Murray Holiday area, Cottonwood Heights, some of those areas are extremely difficult to search. And if you folks would like, anytime you'd like to come in, I'd love to walk you through how a search and examination of title is done, and just so you can see the process. But oftentimes in that part of town, those searches can take a week, 10 days. It's a really busy area and nothing is straight north, south, east, and west. So the legal descriptions and everything get very complex in those areas, and hopefully your title company is reaching out to you if they're in one of those areas and letting you know, hey, we can't get the commitment out to you by the seller disclosure deadline. So you might want to do an addendum to extend that until we can get the commitment. So, okay. I'm going to skip over to 8.3 top. There we go. Okay, and again, here I'm going to talk about the earnest money again under the buyer's right to cancel. It says that a portion of the buyer's earnest money can be released to the seller without requirements of further written instruction from buyer, and the remainder of buyer's earnest money deposit shall be released to the buyer without further written authorization from seller. Now, again, I want everybody to understand that's assuming that the money is being held by the brokerage. If the money is being held by the title company, a title company is under a totally different set of rules and guidelines as a fiduciary, that once we receive money, money cannot be dispersed without written instruction from both buyer and seller, because we're not part of the negotiation process and everything. We have no idea if there were additional addendums, if there were any verbal agreements, anything of that nature. So really important to note that the earnest money being released without further written instruction is based on the fact that under the very first paragraph of the contract, it says it's being held by the buyer's brokerage. So that will be keyword number 2 today, earnest money. So if everybody wants to write that down. Okay, everybody got that? All right, and then under 8.3 III, earnest money deposits released to seller, it just says that the buyer agrees that the buyer's earnest money deposit or deposits shall be released to the seller without the requirement of further written authorization from buyer. So that's, again, something to note, that we get calls all the time if we're holding earnest money saying, well, the buyer canceled, release it back to the buyer because we canceled within our due diligence, or the seller calls and says the buyer did not cancel within their due diligence, release the earnest money to me. So we end up in the middle of that, and so we cannot release the money without any additional written instruction between buyer and seller, which I know creates a lot of frustration sometimes for real estate agents, but it'll kind of explain itself here in a minute as we go through this, and I'll get into earnest money a little more detail as far as having the title company hold it for you. Okay, this is another great thing that they added under 8.4, the additional earnest money deposit, and especially in this market right now, that might be a great tool to use to try to get some offers accepted, in that the buyer will or will not, and if you wanted to put the buyer will deposit some additional earnest money once they've done some of their due diligence, then it might be a good way to get a seller to accept your offer versus another offer. So, and then number 9 just talks about any addenda, if there's any addendums to the contract that we know about immediately up front, like if the buyer's getting an FHA or VA loan. Number 10 talks about the home warranty plan. Again, that is negotiable as far as who's going to pay that between the buyer, the seller, or if it's going to be split between the parties. So that can be negotiated. Again, if you're representing the buyer, make sure you just say that the seller will pay for it. And if the seller wants to renegotiate that, they'll have to do so through an addendum. Okay, and then I want to go on to paragraph 13. Okay, this is really important, you guys, as far as the authority of the signers, to make sure that you have a valid contract in place. If you go out on a listing appointment and you find out that the title is in an LLC or a corporation or a trust or something like that, communicate that to your escrow officer as soon as you can in the transaction, because we can actually access, and even when you're going out on your listing appointment, we can actually access through the Secretary of State LLC information and corporate information for corporations to give you at least an idea of who's listed on there at that time through the Secretary of State. So that you know, yes, okay, I am dealing with the president, or I am dealing with the secretary, or I am dealing with one of the members of an LLC. Because the last thing you want to have happen is we get the wrong person to sign the contract and then we don't have a valid contract in place. So get with your title company as soon as possible. If the property's in a trust, that's another reason to get your title company involved quickly and get your seller to get a copy of those trust documents to you and get it to your escrow officer for review. Because there are most trusts are done for estate planning purposes, but there are some trusts that get very detailed, an actual working trust that operates just like a corporation or an LLC that's receiving money, dispersing money, things of that nature. And I have seen a couple of trusts where it says that the trustee could not distribute any assets of the trust without the approval of the beneficiaries. So if there's 6 or 8 beneficiaries of a trust and we have to go get approval from all of them, that could take a little time and could be a little bit problematic. So make sure that we're dealing with that as soon as possible in the transaction. Okay, and then I'm going to skip down to paragraph 19. No assignment, okay? This is important because there's some arguments on this still today. This was put in there to avoid double contracts and to avoid somebody putting a transaction together. This came about, this happened a lot back in 2005 to 2010, where people would put a property under contract and things were going so crazy that they would immediately turn around an assignment for another $30,000 to a new buyer. And then they would use that buyer's money to complete the purchase and never tell the seller about it. So this was put into place that says that the contract cannot be assigned without the approval of the seller. So, and we'll get into assignments of contract here in more detail, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands that it is a provision in the contract that contract is not assignable without the approval of the seller, unless it goes specifically to a family partnership or a trust or limited liability company of the buyer. Then they could assign it as long as it's not for a monetary purpose or a monetary reason. Okay, and then under paragraph 21, this is important as well because, as I mentioned before, all timelines under the contract are 5:00 p.m. We oftentimes will have where lenders don't get documents and they ask us, at 7 o'clock at night, don't tell the buyer, let me rephrase that. Don't tell the seller we're not closing until 7. That's fine and dandy. We don't have to necessarily shout out to the world, hey, guess what? The buyer didn't close on time. But if we're ever asked to do so, we're going to have to be honest about that and say, yeah, sorry, the buyer didn't close until 7 o'clock. So just important to note that if we're not going to make a settlement deadline, that's one reason it's really important to work with good lenders so you don't have to keep negotiating. Because one thing I know realtors hate is negotiating settlement deadline extensions. That's never fun, and I know you guys don't like to do it. So good to work with a great lender so that you always get closed on time and you meet that settlement deadline and you don't have to do addendums for extensions. But my suggestion is always, if you're not going to hit it, get an addendum, because to close the next morning or later that day or something could be problematic if a problem comes up between the buyer and the seller wants to be a stinker about it. So it could be a problem. Okay. Then under paragraph 24, again, you guys, on this, I like to just make sure that as the seller disclosure deadlines, give yourself a few days to get that done, to make sure that you get the title report, the CC&Rs, and everything in place before you, so that you're not having problems with that seller disclosure deadline in your contracts. So give yourself a couple days there. Okay. Then we've talked about earnest money, and here's a form that the Division of Real Estate came up with to use in the event that you're going to deposit money with a title company. So this says that under paragraph 1, the REPC is amended as follows. Buyer and seller agree that the earnest money deposit or deposits will be held with a title insurance company instead of deposited in the buyer's brokerage trust account. The title company is located at everything else. So this allows the money to really go to the title company where the contract itself does not. And then it says that buyer and seller advised title insurance company may require through separate written instruments that both the buyer and seller mutually authorize disbursement of the earnest money, even if the REPC states that no additional written authorization is required, which may result in additional delays and costs for either party to receive the earnest money deposits. So it's really important to note that when we have it, when the title company has it, we have to have written confirmation from both parties before we can disperse anything to the buyer or the seller if the contract fails. Okay, and then it says, to the extent of the terms of this addendum modify or conflict with any provisions of the REPC, including all prior addenda and counteroffers, these terms shall control. So when it comes to the earnest money, if it's going to the title company, this document will control versus the contract. So, and I don't necessarily think that you need to use this particular addendum, although it was created for that purpose. But if you just in a separate addendum want to add in there that the earnest money is to be deposited with XYZ title company in a separate addendum, as long as both the buyer and the seller agree to that, you shouldn't have any problems. But just note that if it does go to the title company, there will be additional or maybe additional documents that are going to need to be signed. Okay, and then Chantel, if we can go on to the next page. I don't know, but I like it. Okay, this is from Curtis Bullock of the Division of Real Estate. This just says, don't make the mistake when depositing earnest money at a title company. So they are, and there have been a lot more of these as of recently, fines issued by the Division of Real Estate, $500 for not identifying in the contract that the money is going to a title company. Because if you're the seller and you think that, and there's a problem, and then you go to the title or to the brokerage and the brokerage says, hey, I don't have the money. What does the contract say? It's to be deposited at the buyer's brokerage. You immediately are going to have a problem and you're going to have a complaint filed against you and you're subject to a $500 fine. So just make sure that you are getting something in writing that says that the title company is holding that earnest money. And then here's just a legal opinion from a local attorney. His name's Chris Jessup, that talks about why title companies can't just release money when one party requests it. So it just talks about the duty of care that we have as a fiduciary. And once that money or once documents are received by a title companies cannot release it without further written instruction from the buyer and seller. So really important to note that there is a legal opinion to go along with that, which goes right along with the documents from the Division of Real Estate. Okay, and then next is a bulletin from the Utah Insurance Department that talks about title insurance. I want to go down where it says title insurance producers. Well, I can't really highlight that for you, but title insurance producers that agree to conduct escrow should use detailed written escrow instructions that clearly and unambiguously describe the terms upon which funds are held and dispersed. So every title company has a standard of care to the buyer and seller that when money comes into our accounts, we have to have something in writing that indicates why and what we're to do with it and how we're to disperse it later. Okay. Then Utah Land Title Association created two forms, the ULTA's joint escrow instructions and the release of earnest money. And I won't get into those a whole lot, but Chantel, if you'll scroll down. So if you don't want to use the Division of Real Estate form for having the earnest money go to the title company, you can use these joint escrow instructions that every title company has access to through the ULTA or the Utah Land Title Association. So you can sure use these. And just so that you know, paragraph 4 on this says, if the transaction is canceled or does not close for any reason, the company will disperse the money only, the earnest money only after receipt of mutual written instructions from buyer and seller. So again, just note that buyer and seller are going to have to approve any release of earnest money. Okay, and then hand in hand with that, the next document is a release of earnest money that the Utah Land Title Association has prepared for all title agencies to use. So you can use that form to get the earnest money released, and title companies should be requiring that if they're not before releasing any earnest money, or a simple addendum between buyer and seller stating earnest money is to be released to buyer, earnest money is to be released to seller. That would be sufficient as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be this form, but it has to have something in writing. Okay, and then the next is just a standard addendum. You're all familiar with this. One thing I want to mention, and when you get into these addendums, don't negotiate lease options and things like that through this addendum. There's specific forms. I see people oftentimes will just write out lease option terms on an addendum, and that's not really a good idea because there is a lease option addendum, and we'll go over that in a few minutes. But make sure that you're using board-approved forms for specific purposes if you're going to use those. Okay, the FHA VA loan addendum. Probably the most important part on this is, it states that the seller will make certain appraisal required repairs not to exceed a certain dollar amount, provide a pest control and take care of that, eradicate the pests not to exceed a certain dollar amount. But probably the most important thing there is section 5.1, where it says that the seller shall contribute certain amounts towards the buyer's closing costs. Always verify with your lender before you're making offers that that this is going to be, that you're asking for a correct amount. Because if there's leftover money, it really just goes back to the seller. So the buyer doesn't really have the option to say, hey, let's create some other closing costs. I've had people say, well, let's buy the refrigerator, or let's do this, or let's do that to use up the balance. Not unless it's in an addendum, folks. You can't just use that money for any other purpose. It's got to be used for the closing costs, and partially because that has to be agreed to by the lender. If we're going to be purchasing a fridge or something to use the rest of that balance, there are some things that you can do, such as doing an additional year of home warranty coverage. Things like that. If there's an overage, you can get a 2-year home warranty or things like that. So there are things that you can do, but it's going to, again, have to be approved by the lender and reflected on the settlement statement as far as any monies coming through the transaction. Okay, and then let's see. Yeah, and then we can't do escrow holds or things like that either. I've had people do that. Say, well, let's hold the additional 1,500 in escrow for repairs. Okay, well, unless there's legitimate repairs, cannot do that. That would be again a double contract, which the lender would come down on the title insurance company big time for doing that. So. Just note that any leftover money is going to have to be negotiated unless you can come up with a legitimate closing cost that the lender has approved. Okay, and then here is the real estate purchase for land. Oftentimes you don't get to use this anymore because most developers and builders have their own contracts that they use, but there is a purchase contract for land that the Division of Real Estate has available to you. Again, it states the earnest money will be delivered to the buyer's brokerage. And where it identifies the property, you guys, if you're dealing with meets and bounds descriptions, big pieces of land, or a new subdivision, I recommend that where it says under paragraph 1, the property, also described as, see if you can get a lot number or a tax parcel number that you can put in there. That's always helpful, because on some big tracts of land where it's vacant property, or if it's a brand new lot in a subdivision, the property address may not be available. So it can be sometimes really difficult to find that property just by an address. So if you can include a lot number or a tax parcel number right there, that's always very helpful for the title company. The rest of this is pretty much self-explanatory as far as, and again, it talks about water rights and water shares. So if you're representing a seller, make sure that any water rights, especially on land like we talked about before, that they are reserving any water shares that they want to retain. Okay, section 3.3 on the land contract. Boy, this can be to the tunes of hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the land under 3.3, the Greenbelt Taxes. So what that says is if any portion of the property is presently assessed as Greenbelt, the payment of any rollback taxes assessed against the property shall be paid for by, and then again, it's negotiable. If you're representing the buyer, you obviously want the seller to pay it. If you're representing the seller, you might want to try to get it split equally, or even see if the buyer will pay it. But the problem is at the time you're negotiating these contracts, people don't usually know what that rollback tax is. So, and for those of you who don't understand Greenbelt, let me just explain that to you real quick. If a farmer is using a property for farmland, agriculture, or even livestock, then they can apply with the county treasurer and the county assessor for a Greenbelt exemption. So their properties, rather than being $20,000 a year, could be $17 a year. But what happens is the minute that property comes out of Greenbelt, and that will happen, the property comes out the minute title is transferred. When that property comes out of Greenbelt, the county then rolls back 5 years and assesses that property at full market value for 5 years, which is what they call a rollback tax. And that is, as you can imagine, could be very, very expensive. So really important to know that you may even want to get with your title company before, if you know the property's in Greenbelt, find out what the amounts are so that you can negotiate it correctly, and so that your seller isn't caught with a big surprise, or your buyer isn't caught with a big surprise. Now, there are certain cases where the buyer, maybe the buyer doesn't want to change it, doesn't want to take it out of Greenbelt on that transfer of title. So they can actually contact the county assessor, the county treasurer, and apply to leave it as a Greenbelt so that the transfer of title doesn't immediately kick in the rollback taxes. But it's really important at that point that your title company prepare a document that says that the buyer agrees to assume and pay all rollback taxes, and they're instructing you to leave the property in Greenbelt at this time. Otherwise, things get forgotten later down the road, and once the transaction records, it supersedes the contract, and so you may have some problems. So if the buyer is going to leave the property in Greenbelt, it is really important that there is a separate document that addresses that. Okay, and then under 3.4, the special assessments. Something else to be aware of here just says any assessments for capital improvements as approved by the HOA, just like we talked about before on the residential contract, is negotiable as far as who pays those. But another thing to remember on land, if you're buying a lot, or if you're going to apply for a building permit anytime soon, there are connection fees or impact fees that may be payable in connection with that. So really important to look into what fees may be associated with getting a building permit from the municipality where that permit would be issued, from the various cities and things like that, because I know in places like Immigration Canyon, sometimes areas of the Cottonwood Canyons do have some pretty stiff, and Wasatch County is another one, Summit County, do have some pretty stiff impact fees that go towards schools and things like that when people apply for a building permit. So make sure that you know for your buyer's sake what connection fees or impact fees may be associated with getting a building permit for that property. And then under 6.2, as we talked about on the residential contract, it requires a homeowner's or EGLE policy of title insurance. And on this one, it requires a standard policy of title insurance, standard coverage owner's policy. The reason for that is because there's no improvements, obviously. So there's no reason to have mechanics in coverage and things like that, unless you go out and if you're representing a buyer and maybe there's been some recent construction, there's a backhoe sitting on the property, something like that, then at that point, you may want to ask the seller to provide for a homeowner's policy. If you see there's been some recent work or something that's happened on the property, maybe they've delivered a bunch of trusses and set on there, or you don't know. But if it looks like there's been any recent improvements or materials that have been provided for that property, it may be a great idea to then do an addendum to require the seller to provide a homeowner's policy. But let me rephrase that. Let me step back. Not a homeowner's policy, an extended coverage owner's policy. Because the homeowner's policy can only be issued on improved properties with a home, but you can get an extended owner's policy that will cover against mechanics liens and things like that. So you might want to look into getting that coverage for your buyer if it looks like there's been any improvements. And then under paragraph 7, again, the seller disclosures require a commitment for title insurance and any restrictive covenants. Those restrictive covenants are really important to a buyer. On a lot purchase or anything where they may be building a home, because it'll dictate what kind of materials can be used in the home, what square footage, the minimum square footage requirements for a home, whether there can be 2-story or not, whether there can be a detached garage or not. You can raise chickens, hogs, have junk cars, things of that nature. So really important to get those, make sure that your buyer does receive those and reviews those to make sure they're not going to have any problem with purchasing the lot and then building the home that they want to build on it, or making the improvements that they want to make on it. Okay, then everything else here is pretty self-explanatory. 11.2 is not in the residential contract, the escrow to complete work. So it just says that if at the time of settlement work has not been completed, for whatever, maybe the seller hasn't got the concrete in or the sidewalks or something like that, then we can actually escrow the money to take care of that. And it should be completed within 30 calendar days. And then Chantel, then again, paragraph 19 says that the contract cannot be assigned. So you cannot assign this contract to a new buyer without the approval of the seller. So, and this again was put in to prevent double contracts and to protect the seller from people who were taking advantage of them and telling their property was only worth X when it was really worth X, and then they put it under contract and then assign it. So that's what that's there for. Okay, that's it on that one. Okay, then I want to get to another Department of Insurance bulletin that talks about escrowed funds for lot reservations. This gets to be a big deal, especially right now. I mean, in a market like this, it's just everybody is wanting a lot, everybody's wanting a home. I mean, and there's just not enough inventory out there for everybody. So many of the builders or developers will take lot reservations for their upcoming subdivisions. And this just tells you that the title companies cannot hold that lot reservation money because there's no contemplated policy to be issued until such time as that plat actually records and you've got an actual written REPC in place. So when you're doing lot reservations, that has to be done directly with the builder or the developer. Okay, you drink water here. If I'm going too fast, you guys, sometimes I get talking like an auctioneer. So tell me to slow down, or any comments or anything, please jump in. Okay, this is the new construction contract. And again, very rarely do you guys get to use this. All the builders, almost all of the builders have their own contracts that they make your buyers sign, and they're 60 pages long. And the only thing I want to make sure of is that you understand when you're looking through those, that almost every single one of them are going to state that the seller or the builder will only provide a standard owner's policy. So they're not giving any coverage whatsoever for any mechanics liens, anything like that. So when you get those contracts, I strongly suggest, because I have seen a couple of lawsuits that buyers have brought when there's mechanics liens that are filed against title companies and their real estate agents for not telling them that there is a different policy available that would have covered them. So whenever you're dealing with new construction, again, remember that builder's contract is going to say that they're only going to issue a standard coverage policy. So make sure, number one, you can always do an addendum that says seller to provide a homeowner's policy. They're usually going to say no, but at least offer your buyer the option to purchase that additional coverage, because they always have that option to purchase that themselves. And at least you've got something in writing that says, hey, I told them they could purchase a homeowner's policy and pay for the difference. So they elected not to. So it'll just keep your butt out of trouble if and when any mechanics liens come up. And hopefully if the market continues to stay the way it is, we won't see any mechanics liens for a long time. But boy, from 2009 to 2014, very few subdivisions and builders did not have mechanics liens popping up. So for unpaid materials and labor. So something to always keep in mind to protect your buyers and to protect yourselves so that your buyer can't come back on you. And then under 1.1, the location again. This one actually spells out if you've got a lot number. So also described as lot number. If you've got that information, that's always good to put in there. It just helps the title company find the property, because if it's a new home again, or a new subdivision, oftentimes those addresses don't show up. So, okay, and then what's different here is not only do they have the earnest money deposit, but they also have construction deposits. And section 2.2 talks about the delivery of the construction deposits. They're going to go to the seller, and whether or not they're non-refundable. So just something to keep in mind there. And then special assessments again are addressed under 3.3. Thank you. So that you can negotiate those. But again, normally you're not going to have the option to use this contract if you're doing new construction. And normally the builder's contract is going to require the buyer to pay an initial fee up front to help get the HOA established and up and running. So usually they'll collect 2 or 3 months up front from the buyer. So if you're in an HOA, if you're doing a condo or a twin home of some kind, or there's any type of HOA, just something to be aware of in the builder's contracts to look for that and see what they're going to require from your buyer. Okay, and then section 6.2. This does, and I commend the Division of Real Estate on this, this does require, so if you've got a builder who will let you use this form, it does require the seller to provide a homeowner's policy to give that mechanics lien coverage to the buyer. So everybody knows how important that is for a buyer to get that coverage on new construction. So, and then 6.3 talks about the protection against liens and civil action. Notice is hereby, and I'm just going to read this to you real quick. Notice is hereby provided in accordance with the Residence Lien Restriction and Lien Recovery Fund Act of the Utah Code that an owner may be protected against mechanics liens being maintained against an owner-occupied residence and from other civil action being maintained to recover monies owed for qualified services performed or provided by suppliers and subcontractors as part of this contract. The Mechanics Lien Recovery Fund is still there, but in 2019, they passed a law that the builders and developers, as part of their licensing fees, no longer had to contribute any additional money into that recovery fund. So as that gets depleted and goes down, it's still there right now for the protection of a buyer, but as that gets depleted and goes down, there may not be enough money left to cover your buyers. So just important to note there. And then in order to qualify for the Mechanics Lien Recovery Fund, this goes in and spells out what you have to do to qualify. So you've got to have a written contract with your contractor. The contractor has to be a licensed contractor. You have to pay the full amounts owed under the contract, and it has to be an owner-occupied property. So if all of those situations occur, then the buyer may have some coverage through the Mechanics Lien Recovery Fund. But like I said, for the last couple of years, well, since 2019, there have not been additional funds being deposited into that fund. Okay, the seller disclosures here are a little bit different. They also require the plans and specifications for the residence, the name of the contractors and the contractor's license number to be provided to the buyer, and the builder's warranty. So the builder has to disclose what type of a warranty they're giving to the buyer for construction. Obviously, on new construction, you don't need a home warranty because all of the appliances and everything that are being put in the home have their manufacturer's warranties on them. So you're not going to have any need for a home warranty on new construction. Okay, section 8.2 talks about the financing and a construction loan. One thing to always remember here is if your buyer is going to take out their own construction loan, which a lot of the smaller builders require, because they just don't have the same amount of funds as an Edge Homes or a Richmond American or an Ivory. So they don't have those big construction loan lines of credit. So oftentimes they'll require the buyer to get their own construction loan. If the builder requires the buyer to do so, I highly recommend that you have something stating that you've told the buyer that they should make sure that they sign off on any and all construction draws or drafts. Because if they give ultimate control to that builder to do so, and some of the construction lenders do have their documents set up that way that the general contractor can make requests for draws, boy, that puts the buyer in a difficult spot, because if the seller gets in trouble and they're taking from Peter to pay Paul, all of a sudden there's not enough money left to complete the construction on the home, and then you have mechanics liens and everything else. So if the builder requires your buyer to take out their own construction loan, maybe get something that you've disclosed to the buyer that they should approve any and all draws. And then if they don't, they have no recourse against you. They have no recourse against the title company. They just elected to trust that builder, and if they get in trouble, they get in trouble. So, okay, and then the preferred lender under section 8.3, most of your builders and, or let me rephrase that, most of your builders, if not all of the builders anymore, seem to have a preferred lender and a preferred title company. So if that's the case, you always have the ability to have choice, but they may not pay for an owner's policy. If you have a relationship with a particular title company or title agency or escrow officer and you want to use them, you always can. But they do have, and I don't quite understand how it works under RESPA, but they seem to all have something in there that says that if you don't use their preferred people, then they won't pay for anything. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, and then under paragraph 11, I just wanted to touch on that real quick, that the seller does warranty the heating, cooling, electrical, plumbing, and landscape sprinkler systems against defects for a period of 1 year. So that's a good thing to have in there. Okay, 12.1 talks about the walkthrough inspection and when that takes place. So that's different than the other contracts. Paragraph 20, again, states no assignment. So this contract cannot be assigned without the approval of the seller. And section 21.1 talks about the insurance. Buyer will probably want to have an insurance policy in place during the construction period to make sure that if there's a fire or something of that nature, make sure the builder has that insurance in place. So if a fire or something happens partway through construction, there's coverage. Okay. The next we're going to come to is the commercial real estate contract. So the first thing you're going to notice that's different here, which I'm not sure why, but this contract actually gives you the option right up front in paragraph 1 to deposit the money with a title or escrow company, where all of the other contracts state it has to go to the buyer's brokerage. The commercial contract actually says that it may be deposited with the brokerage or title or escrow company. So that makes it really simple. And then it just says where it's going to go. So that solves all of those issues and problems and questions. Okay, and then the only difference here under section 2, the purchase price, is they do talk about a loan assumption agreement on commercial property. That's a little more common than it is on residential. However, with interest rates the way they are right now, I remember back in the 80s and early 90s, we did do a lot of assumptions. And the way interest rates are right now, if they get up around 6 or 7% again, even 5%, we may start seeing some assumptions now on residential property. But just to note, the commercial contract does automatically under 2C allow for an assumption agreement. Okay, paragraph 6 on this contract is different than the others, wherein it states and gives you the option to provide under 6A either a general warranty deed or a special warranty deed. So it actually gives you the option to negotiate that right up front. And then under C, excuse me, 1 minute, please. Okay, and then under 6C, it says the buyer elects to obtain a full coverage extended ALTA policy of title insurance. That always includes a survey, you guys, and that's something that a lot of people miss and don't understand, that a survey will be required to issue that policy. And it gives the ability to negotiate who's going to pay for that, the buyer or seller. If you're representing the buyer, I recommend put the seller is going to pay for it. But the seller will have to provide a survey as well in order to get that policy. Okay, and then under paragraph 7, the difference there is under 7D of the seller disclosures. And again, still the commitment and everything else is part of those seller disclosures, but here you have to have operating statements for the property for the last fiscal year. So it does require operating statements for a working commercial property be provided to the buyer as part of the seller disclosures. Okay, everything else is the same until we get to paragraph 14. This is also different than the other contracts in that it gives you the ability to assign the contract without restriction from the seller. So that's very interesting. Although, as a title company, we are going to require that any assignment for money is going to have to be shown on the settlement statement so that nothing's hidden from the seller. But it actually gives you the ability to say that the contract shall be assignable by the buyer, except as so restricted. This contract shall inure the benefit and to be binding upon the heirs, personal representatives, successors, and assigns of the parties. So it gives the buyer right up front the ability to assign that contract, which is different. Okay. All right, that's it on that one. And then we get to the assumption addendum I talked about. Okay, this talks about the fees and charges for any assumption. And also the most important part of this document, if the buyer is assuming the loan, if you're representing the seller, paragraph 3 is extremely important. It's the release of liability. I don't know of any seller who would ever want to allow a buyer to assume their existing loan and then still be liable for it. Although if somebody's representing the buyer, they may put on there that the sale is not conditioned upon the seller being released from personal liability. So that can be problematic for your seller if the buyer defaults at a later date, because the seller's going to have to step in and cure any default and start making the monthly payments to avoid having their credit harmed. So even if the buyer checks that, I suggest if you're representing the seller, doing an addendum to say that the seller will be released from personal liability. So then at that point, the title company will work directly with the lender. And as part of that assumption package that comes over, the lender will have a release of liability form stating that upon completion of the closing, that the seller is released of all liability on that existing loan. So just something to watch for if you're doing a commercial transaction and there is an assumption, because I guarantee that the buyer is going to put that it is not conditioned. And if you're representing your seller, you're probably going to want that to be a condition. So, okay. The next document we're going to get to, or the next addendum, is a seller financing addendum. Okay, this document is awesome for any seller carrybacks or any all-inclusive trust deeds that you might be doing, or even if the seller is doing a second or a third loan behind an existing new first mortgage. Under paragraph 1 of the credit documents, it talks about the seller's extension of credit to the buyer shall be evidenced by, and then it gives you the option, a note and trust deed, or a note and all-inclusive trust deed, or other. And then just so that everyone understands the difference between the note and trust deed and a note and all-inclusive trust deed, we would use a note and trust deed. You would check that box if the property is free and clear, or if the seller is going to carry back a second behind a new first, or a third behind a new first and second. Then you would check note and trust deed. But if the seller has an underlying obligation that the buyer is going to wrap with this new seller financing, you would use the note and all-inclusive deed of trust. And what that means is that the seller is extending credit to the buyer for whatever equity that they are giving the buyer and the underlying obligation of an existing loan. So let's say, for example, you've got a sales price of $300,000. The seller is going to finance $250,000, require $50,000 down from the buyer, and then there's an underlying obligation of $200,000 to Wells Fargo. So the note and all-inclusive deed of trust would say that it is $250,000, but the note and trust deed in favor of Wells Fargo for $200,000 is senior to the equity of the seller. The seller's equity is junior to that obligation. So Wells Fargo will always get paid first, and then the seller will get paid after that. So really important to understand the difference between just a note and trust deed and a note and all-inclusive trust deed. And if you ever have any questions on that or anything that we're going over today, I'm always available, folks. Please feel free to call me or reach out at any time. I'd love to help you or answer any questions you have, even if we're not handling the transaction. I can't give you any legal advice, but I can give you 35 or 38, holy cow, years of experience. And then on the other documents, sometimes you'll see a uniform real estate contract. We'll get into that a little bit. Or other options like a lease option. I've seen people use the seller financing addendum for a lease option. Don't do that. It can get you in trouble. There is a lease option addendum that we'll go over here in just a minute, but make sure you're using the proper document for the proper forms. Okay, and then under the credit terms, you guys, this is really important. I like to make sure that when we're handling the closing, this just talks about what the interest rate will be, what the buyer and seller have agreed to as an interest rate, and how the payments will be made, and things of that nature. I always recommend that you put that first payment 30 days out from when we're closing, and then we make sure at that time that we are collecting the payment due to the lender. Let's say we're closing on the 20th of this month, so 20th of March. We would want to collect that April 1st payment from the seller at closing and then prorate it so that there was always enough time for whatever escrow company, or if they're going to pay it directly to the seller, there's enough time for the buyer's payment to get to where it needs to go. And then especially on an all-inclusive, if there's an underlying obligation, we want to always make sure there's enough time for that underlying obligation to get paid. So the money's going to move a couple of times there. So really important to work with a seasoned escrow officer and make sure that you're dealing with that at the time of closing so that you're not having late payments showing up on the buyer's very first payment they make. So if they don't make their payment till the 8th of the month, there's no way that the escrow company is going to receive that payment on the 8th of the month and then turn around and get it back out by the 15th to avoid late payments. It's just not going to happen. So really important to make sure that those questions are answered at the closing. The interest is prorated. The escrow accounts are purchased by the buyer. If there's an underlying loan, those escrow accounts need to be purchased by the buyer because those will now become the buyer's property. As they continue to make payments, those escrow accounts will be made for taxes and insurance. So we need to make sure the seller is taken care of there. And then I always recommend you guys, if we're going to do an all-inclusive note and trust deed, always get a copy of the underlying note and get it to your escrow officer as soon as you can. I see these used sometimes, and there can be adjustable rates that apply. There can be, could be a HELOC that's underneath that has a balloon payment. There can be a lot of different scenarios that come up that can cause the buyer and seller a lot of grief if we don't all do our due diligence to make sure that we're not going to have any problems in the future. And most seller financing, they're going to put on here that the unpaid principal balance is due in X amount of months, 2 months, 60 months. Usually a seller is not going to want to extend credit to a buyer for a long term of time, 30 years, like a conventional lender. It's usually for a given situation that they're going to want to do that. So we want to make sure there's no balloon payments or anything that will pop up before our due date on there. Okay, and then taxes and assessments under paragraph 3, talked about the buyer needs to purchase that existing escrow account. Then under paragraph 4, the payment. I always recommend you guys that we use an escrow agent if we're doing these, even if the property's free and clear and the seller is just extending full credit to the buyer, and we're doing just a note and trust deed and not a note and all-inclusive. The reason being is because that escrow agent is going to account for everything. They're going to file all the necessary documents for interest paid and interest earned with the IRS for the buyer and seller. And the fees are really, really reasonable. So, and I always recommend escrow specialists. They've been around forever and ever. There are a few other companies, but I don't have a track record with them like I do with escrow specialists. I really think they're the best, and their fees are very, very reasonable. And then they're going to receive that money. And if it's an all-inclusive note and trust deed, they're going to go pay Wells Fargo. Then they'll send the balance to the seller, whatever's left. And they'll just make sure everything's taken care of, and they'll handle all the payoffs, everything for your buyers and sellers. So That's real important. Okay, and then paragraph 5, where it talks about late payments. As I talked about before, normally your seller's going to have a balloon payment. They're going to say, yeah, I'll extend you credit. We'll amortize it over a 30-year payment period or 20, but I want to be paid in full in 24 months or 60 months. This is really important, you guys, because we've seen situations come up where this has caused a problem where it says, any payment not made within blank days after it is due is subject to a late charge of, say, 10% or 5% if it's like an existing mortgage. But it's really important that as an agent, if you're representing the buyer, that you state that those late payments, like under the credit terms in paragraph 2, where you've got the additional places there where you can negotiate terms, I would suggest that you always state there that the late payments referred to under paragraph 5 below pertain only to the monthly payments to be made and not to the balloon payment. We had a situation where a borrower did an all-inclusive note and trust deed. They were doing everything they were supposed to do, going through with their refinance to pay it off within the 36 months. And then their lender did not get it done for them on time. And they ended up closing 10 days later, and the seller said, well, you missed your balloon payment. You owe 10% of 400 grand. So as you can imagine, that was a big problem. So just be aware that the late payments don't differentiate between monthly payments and a balloon payment. So it's a good idea if you do so, if you're representing your buyer. Okay, then the other thing I want to mention is under paragraph 6, the due on sale clause. Really important to make sure that your escrow officer is putting that on the trust deed that gets recorded, because if they don't put it on there, there's nothing in public record that prevents the buyer from going ahead and selling it or letting somebody assume that balance. So the due on sale clause should always go on there. And then if the holder of the underlying mortgage calls the loan due as a result of the transaction, because there will be a due on sale clause on the underlying loan if we're doing an all-inclusive, there always is. It doesn't matter if it's FHA, Fannie, Freddie, VA, there's always an underlying loan, and we cannot do an all-inclusive on FHA or VA. They forbid it, but it just says that if the holder on the underlying loan calls the payment due or calls the loan due as part of this transaction or because of this transaction, that the buyer agrees to discharge the underlying loan. Well, if the buyer didn't have the money up front to do it and didn't have the credit to do it to get their own loan, they may not have the funds available to immediately refinance it if it's called due. And so your seller is again going to have to step in to protect their credit and take care of that. So just an important thing to note there. Okay, I'm going to go and just skip over to the short sale addendum. Fortunately, we're not seeing a lot of these right now. Yahoo! They were kind of a pain, as we all know. Nothing closed on time. Everything was just, it was chaotic. So, but if the market keeps going the way it is now and appreciation keeps going the way, we may see these again in the future. So just something to be aware of, that the Division of Real Estate does have this addendum available for you to use. And so feel free to do that. Okay, and then this is another bulletin from the Department of Insurance that just says title companies cannot negotiate short sales. There were a lot of title companies at the time offering to negotiate short sales. We are not licensed realtors. We don't have a license to negotiate between a buyer and seller or buyer and lender. So title companies cannot negotiate those. Okay, the third party addendum approval. This just says that the contract is subject to third party approval. That third party could be even the bankruptcy court. So if you know you've got a seller in bankruptcy where we're going to have to get an order from the bankruptcy court approving the sale, anything like that, make sure you're talking with your broker about whether or not you should use this addendum, because it can save your bacon, because oftentimes if we're going through the bankruptcy court or anything, or even if there's some federal tax liens that are on the property or a federal issue of any kind, those things can take some time. So this can be a very valuable addendum if there's other parties who are going to have to approve our sale. Okay, and then we've just got an assignment and assumption addendum. We're getting close on time, so I just want you to know that that is there. As we talked about, for the this one's for new construction at the top, and it says the assignment fee shall be X, and so the seller has to sign and approve that. If the buyer's making money on it, the seller is going to have to sign. So that makes it really simple. And then the assignment of interest, where buyer one does not own the property, same thing. If there's an assignment fee on that, right there, Chantel, thank you. If there's an assignment fee on that, then the seller is going to have to approve that, and knowing that the buyer is making money on the property. And it's under paragraph 7, the seller's consent, and the seller will sign accepting that. Okay, you've got a simultaneous closing addendum, and I really, these documents are great because there were a lot of double contracts and a lot of problems that were happening. And so the Division of Real Estate came up with these documents to allow people to complete those transactions, but there's complete disclosure. There's nothing hidden from anybody. So you can still do these, but just use these board forms if you've got a simultaneous closing. And the reason for that is under the next bulletin from the Department of Insurance, right there. It talks about prohibited escrows. And I won't read all of that to you, but on page 3, Chantel, if you'll scroll up. Thank you. Okay, on page 3, it talks about what's a legal flip or an illegal flip, or what they call equity skimming. These documents allow you to do legal flips. The simultaneous closing, A sells to B, B sells to C, C pays B everything that's owed under their contract, B pays A everything that's owed under their contract, and life is good and everybody's happy. But where we get in trouble is under an illegal flip, and the Department of Insurance will, I mean, they'll shut somebody down for closing these types of deals, or create some hefty fines. But if A sells to B and B sells to C, and then C's money is used to complete B's contract with A, everybody's going to have problems. That's just not a good idea, and that got everybody in a lot of trouble back in the 2000s. So just so you know that can happen. Okay, then I talked about the lease agreement with option to purchase earlier, and that is going to be our third keyword, is lease option. Okay, what I want to make sure of here is that you guys, as I talked about before, don't ever use just a regular addendum or the seller financing addendum for a lease option. Make sure you use this document, because there is a lot of verbiage in here that protects you. Because here's the biggest problem with a lease option is that if there, and most attorneys that I've ever talked to about this, and some of the lawsuits I've seen come up, if there's a substantial deposit made by the buyer, and if a portion of the buyer's money is going towards a final purchase price, then the doctrine of equitable conversion really kicks in here, and the buyer has an equitable interest. So no longer are they merely a tenant. So this could be very problematic if they put $20,000 down and $600 of their monthly payment every month is going towards a purchase price. It essentially is like a uniform real estate contract versus a lease option. So it really doesn't keep a tenant and a landlord. So if you use the lease option, try to keep it that way. Keep it as a lease, so the buyer doesn't have an equitable interest. But if you run into a situation, and some people use these for that, and that's why it's there for you, I always recommend get with your broker if they're putting a substantial amount of money down, and possibly get a document signed that says that you've advised them that the buyer, especially if you're representing the seller, that the buyer may have an equitable interest by reason of a large deposit, because then they can't come back on you later when they find out that they can't just evict the buyer as a tenant, and they've got to actually go and pursue and sue the buyer for a default judgment under the terms of the lease, and then obtain that judgment and then foreclose judicially, which they have to do through the sheriff's office versus like a trustee on a trust deed. And that takes 180 days to complete that. And then it takes another 180 days afterwards. The buyer has time to, or what they call, the buyer has I'm trying to think of what it's called. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Anyway, there's a redemption period. Sorry, there's a 180-day redemption period that the buyer has after the foreclosure is completed by the sheriff. So as you can see, by the time the seller goes and gets a judgment, sues the buyer, obtains a judgment, starts foreclosure, completes foreclosure, and then lets the redemption period expire before they can actually get a sheriff's deed, they could be in that process of trying to get a buyer out of that home for 3 or 4 years. So, and you don't want to be part of that nightmare. So if you're doing a lease option, my suggestion is try to keep it as a lease. But if you're doing a substantial amount of money down and your part of the payments are going towards the purchase price, talk with your broker and see whether or not it might be a good idea to just get something that says you've suggested to the seller that they seek legal advice so that you guys don't get in any trouble. Okay, so other than that, you know what, we're 11:30, so guess what? I'm gonna let you guys on the rest of this. This is just the notice of intent to purchase and stuff there. So one thing I did want to mention, Chantel, if you can, you got the notice of intent that's done, okay, and then if you can get to the very end, the agreement, keep going. Okay, the Department of Insurance, if you can go up, up to next, up. There you go. Okay, so the Department of Insurance does allow us to conduct escrows on water, farmland, and mobile homes. So, and many of you probably did not know that. So we have a simple little agreement to sell, if you can scroll down. If you get in a situation where you need some assistance on closing a mobile home or a manufactured home that's not real property, we can sure assist you with that. So we've got a little agreement to sell manufactured home contract that you can use that we're happy to provide to you. We've got some mobile home closing instructions that we can provide. And then the affidavit of a fixture we can use in the event that we find out that the mobile home is actually being taxed as real property, then we wouldn't be able to sell it as a mobile home, but we can file an affidavit of a fixture with the county so that they can then, it becomes real property and a fixed versus personal property and movable. Okay, and then just detecting double contracts. You know, follow your heart. Is the best I can tell you. If it feels wrong or seems wrong, or somebody's making more money than, or let me rephrase that, somebody's sneaking money out of the deal in some way or another that's not represented to all the parties, man, walk away. It's not worth it. It's not worth your livelihood. And you know, we'll see things like straw buyers and things like that come up, and there's just all kinds of fun and crazy things that I think for people to sit around, there must be a lot smarter people than me. I would never have the time or the effort to sit around and think of all these little schemes. But we see fake cashier's checks. We see people asking escrow officers to tell them funds were received and they really weren't. There's mortgage stacking that comes along. There's just all kinds of problems that can present themselves. So, you know, I just recommend, you know, if it doesn't feel right, talk to somebody, talk to your broker, talk to an attorney, make sure that you're keeping yourselves out of trouble. And with that, I thank you all very much. And then the fourth and last keyword today is its title. So ITS title. And I really appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully you guys got some valuable information. If I did my job today, I hope to help you avoid at least one pitfall in your career. So thank you all so much.
Whoa.